The air in the studio was a live wire, humming with an electric anticipation that crackled from the towering lights to the polished floor. Cameras, like predatory birds, circled the set, their lenses hungry, waiting for the kill. This wasn't just another Tuesday. It was supposed to be a spectacle. And at its heart was Real Talk with Rosie, a political comedy show where Rosie O'Donnell reigned supreme, her throne built on an unapologetic tone and a relentless barrage of biting commentary. She thrived here, a queen in her court, her brutal wit a scepter, her sarcasm a crown. Every laugh from the audience was a reaffirmation of her dominion, every gasp a testament to her power. But today's guest lineup was different. Rumors had been swirling all week, whispers turning into a roar. A surprise appearance from Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in American history. Rosie wasn't thrilled. "She's just a mouthpiece," she'd scoffed to her team during rehearsal, her voice laced with disdain. "Trump's little cheerleader. What's she even doing here? It's not a babysitting hour." The producers, however, had been insistent. Ratings had dipped, and a real-time clash between Rosie's brutal wit and Karoline's sharp, controlled demeanor was exactly the kind of viral content they craved, the kind of spectacle that could reignite the show's flickering flame. Backstage, a different kind of energy pulsed. Karoline sat perfectly still, legs crossed, her navy blazer smooth and structured, a simple cross necklace glinting against her collarbone. She wasn't new to confrontation. The White House briefing room was a daily crucible. But this was different. Rosie didn't play fair. She mocked, twisted, exaggerated. Karoline had been warned, don't let her control the room. Control. The word resonated within her. Karoline didn't intend to let anyone control anything, especially not her. Her composure was not a facade. It was a fortress built of conviction and quiet strength. She mentally rehearsed not lines but principles, preparing for the onslaught not with aggression but with an unwavering clarity. The countdown began, each number a drumbeat. 3, 2, 1. The theme music hit, a blaring fanfare, and the crowd roared, a wave of sound crashing against the studio walls. Rosie entered first, arms wide, a smile plastered on her face, her ego perhaps even wider. "Welcome to Real Talk," she boomed, her voice filling every corner of the room, "where truth gets a mic and nonsense gets exposed." She paused, her eyes gleaming with mischief, a smirk playing on her lips as she turned to the other chair. "And speaking of nonsense," she purred, the words dripping with condescension, "please welcome Trump's press, Karoline Leavitt." The audience, well-trained, erupted in laughter. Karoline walked out to the center, her steps composed, deliberate, the studio lights hitting her like heat from a furnace. She smiled lightly, nodded at the crowd, and sat without flinching, a picture of calm in the eye of the impending storm.
Rosie wasted no time. The applause for Karoline's composed entrance had barely faded when Rosie leaned into her microphone, her eyes glinting with predatory amusement. "So, Karoline," she began, her voice dripping with a faux sweetness that barely masked the venom, "tell me, do you write your own lines or does Trump fax them straight to your brain?" Laughter, loud and immediate, erupted from the audience, a familiar chorus that usually signaled Rosie's victory. But Karoline didn't flinch. She simply smiled lightly, a subtle curve of the lips that held no amusement, only precision. Her voice, when it came, was calm, clear, and utterly unruffled. "I speak for the American people, Rosie, not for your studio's laugh track." The tension in the room snapped like a whip. A few in the crowd gasped, the sound sharp and audible. Others leaned forward, their faces a mixture of shock and intrigue. Rosie blinked. Her smile, usually so fixed, faltered for the briefest moment. She wasn't used to pushback. Not this early, not this direct. Her brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Well," she shot back, forcing a chuckle, "you're certainly trained well. Did they teach sarcasm at MAGA headquarters or just obedience?" More laughs, but they were thinner now, less assured. Karoline stayed still, her posture unwavering. Her voice, however, came back like a razor, sharp and clean. "I speak for the American people, Rosie, not for your studio's laugh track." The air in the studio shifted again, growing heavier, charged. Rosie's smile tightened, becoming a mere line across her face. They were only 5 minutes in, and already it wasn't going as planned. What Rosie didn't know, couldn't possibly fathom, was that Karoline hadn't come to survive this interview, she had come to win it. Rosie leaned forward in her chair, eyes gleaming with the familiar thrill of verbal combat. She was no stranger to this dance. She'd made a career out of tearing down politicians, pundits, and celebrities with a single sarcastic breath. But tonight, Karoline wasn't folding, and that, more than anything, made Rosie itch for control. "Oh, come on," Rosie chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Truth from the Trump team? That's rich. Do you even know how irony works?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth lifting not in amusement, but in a chilling precision. "Irony," she stated, her voice steady, "is sitting in that chair, calling yourself a comedian while pushing talking points like a DNC intern." A few in the audience laughed nervously, caught between the two forces. Rosie's smirk faltered, truly, for the briefest moment. She leaned back, but her posture tightened, a coiled spring. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you're cute, like trying her best in a big girl's world. Cute." There it was, the classic belittling tactic. The crowd gave a mix of laughs and groans, unsure how to react. Karoline didn't flinch. She just leaned in, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the studio noise. "Belittling women. So progressive of you, Rosie." A ripple moved through the room. Some clapped, a defiant sound. Others stayed frozen, unsure whether to laugh or listen. Rosie, now slightly flustered, tried a different tactic, her eyes darting. "You know, I remember when press secretaries actually had credentials, not just a resume with Fox News intern and Trump's echo chamber on it." Karoline didn't blink. "And I remember when late-night hosts told jokes instead of recycling party lines." The moderator, clearly not expecting this level of fire, jumped in, his voice strained. "Ladies, let's keep it respectful." Rosie turned to him, her eyes flashing. "I'm being very respectful. I haven't even brought up the scandals yet." Karoline looked directly at Rosie, her eyes steady, unyielding. "You mean the ones you invent when your ratings drop?" The air grew heavier, thick with unspoken challenge. Rosie's laughter returned, but it sounded thinner, brittle. "All right," she said, flipping to her note cards with mock drama. "Let's talk about the border, shall we? Your administration rips families apart like it's Black Friday at a clearance sale. How do you sleep at night, Karoline?" Karoline didn't smile now. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. "I sleep just fine, knowing we're protecting this country's laws. What keeps you up, Rosie? Our border agents or your conscience?" A low "Whoa!" came from the crowd. For the first time, Rosie hesitated, and Karoline, sensing the opening, sat back with calm authority. She wasn't here to be likable. She was here to be undeniable. Rosie adjusted in her seat, her cards clenched tighter than before. Her jokes weren't landing like they used to. Karoline wasn't rising to the bait, and the audience, usually obedient in their laughter, was now divided. Some clapped for Karoline's sharp retorts, others stayed tense, unsure whether to laugh or listen. So Rosie pushed harder, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "You talk a big game for someone whose entire job is defending a man who brags more than he governs," she said, squinting, as if trying to see through Karoline. "I mean, really, does Trump even know what truth is?" Karoline met her gaze, unflinching. "Does Hollywood?" The room froze again, the air thick with unspoken challenge. Rosie's smile cracked just slightly, revealing the strain beneath. Karoline leaned forward, not in aggression, but with a chilling clarity. "Let's not pretend you're here for the truth, Rosie. You're here for spectacle. You insult, mock, and twist because it gets clicks. But while you're chasing punchlines, we're working on real issues with real people." Rosie scoffed, a dismissive sound. "Real people, honey? You've lived in a political bubble since college." Karoline nodded slowly, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. "And you've lived on a soundstage since the 90s. Which one of us do you think understands the American worker better?" The audience stirred, a low murmur rippling through the rows. Someone in the back shouted, "Let her talk!" No one could tell for whom it was meant, a testament to the shifting loyalties in the room. Rosie reached for a new card, her movements betraying her agitation. Her fingers fumbled slightly. You think you're strong, Karoline, but you're just Trump's shield. Her voice rose, dripping with contempt. A pretty face sent to take the hits while he hides behind tweets. Karoline's voice dropped. Cool, focused, cutting through Rosie's bluster. I don't hide behind anything. I've stood on stages, taken the heat, and faced questions far tougher than yours. And unlike most in this town, I don't need applause to know I'm doing the right thing. For a moment, the audience was dead silent. Even the camera operators leaned in, captivated. Rosie swallowed, blinking rapidly, her usual quick retort absent. Karoline didn't gloat. She simply sat back, composed, hands folded. This wasn't about winning a moment. It was about exposing a pattern. And for the first time in a long time, Rosie O'Donnell wasn't in control of the room. The studio lights felt hotter now, not because of their brightness, but because of the tension pulsing through the air. Rosie flipped through her cue cards faster, her fingers betraying her frustration. The show was supposed to humiliate Karoline, not elevate her. But something was happening. The crowd, usually predictable and eager to cheer Rosie's every jab, was shifting. One woman in the front row leaned forward, not with a smirk, but with curiosity. A student in the back stopped recording, simply watching. Something in Karoline's poise, her restraint, her refusal to match Rosie's mockery blow for blow, it commanded attention. Rosie tried to regain footing, her voice sharp. You're defending a man who divides this country. Tell me, Karoline, how does it feel to be the mouthpiece for the most controversial president in modern history? Karoline looked at her, unbothered. It feels like carrying the weight of truth through a storm of noise. It feels like knowing people will twist your words, mock your values, and still choosing to speak because silence helps no one. A small round of clapping broke out in the center row. Rosie shot a quick glare in the direction of the sound, but it was already growing. Karoline continued, her voice even and deliberate. I don't speak for applause. I speak because I've met the people who feel forgotten, who are tired of being called names just for loving their country. They don't care about showbiz insults. They care about results. Rosie rolled her eyes. You make it sound like Trump invented patriotism. Karoline's eyes narrowed just slightly. No, but he reminded people they didn't have to apologize for it. Boom. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. Rosie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. In the control room, a producer whispered to another, we might need to cut to commercial early. On set, Rosie forced a smile, brittle and unconvincing. Okay, enough with the pageant answers. Let's talk about integrity. How does it feel knowing most of the media world thinks you're a fraud? Karoline didn't blink. I've been underestimated my entire life, and every time it's made me sharper, stronger. If being called a fraud is the price of standing up to the elite echo chamber, then I'll pay it 100 times over. Another clap, this time louder, more confident. Rosie's smirk wavered. And Karoline, she just looked straight into the camera and owned the moment. For the first time in years, Rosie O'Donnell sat on her own set and realized she couldn't control the silence. Not anymore.
Karoline's last line had hit harder than any punchline Rosie could muster. The crowd, once her safety net, had gone quiet. Not from boredom, but from tension, reflection, even a nascent respect. Rosie crossed her legs, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of composure, and forced a chuckle. Wow, someone's been practicing her campaign speech. Karoline raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady, unwavering. Is that what this is to you, Rosie? A game? A joke? Rosie straightened in her chair, her voice defensive, betraying the crack in her carefully constructed facade. No, it's a show, and I don't like being lectured by someone who just got out of political diapers. Laughter tried to stir in the audience, a few nervous titters, but it fizzled fast, unable to find purchase in the heavy air. Karoline didn't miss a beat. And yet you're the one who keeps bringing up my age. Why does it threaten you, Rosie? Rosie flinched, a visible tremor. Karoline continued, not louder, just clearer, her voice cutting through the remaining studio hum. Let me guess. It bothers you that a young woman could come from a small town, work her way up without Hollywood connections, and sit here across from you without bowing? More claps, this time bolder, more confident. Rosie opened her mouth, but no words came, her usual quick wit utterly silenced. Karoline leaned forward, not to attack, but to explain, to dissect. You see someone like me and assume I'm just a pretty face echoing someone else's thoughts. But you know what that tells me? That you don't listen. You label, you muck, and you call it activism. A man in the audience murmured, "She's right." The woman next to him nodded, her eyes fixed on Karoline. Rosie grabbed her water, took a long, slow sip, and finally, her voice strained, asked, "Are you done?" Karoline gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile, not even close. And then, without warning, the studio doors opened. A deep, resonant voice boomed from backstage, cutting through the lingering silence like a thunderclap. "She doesn't need to be done." The crowd turned as one, a collective gasp rippling through the room. Donald J. Trump was walking into the room. Rosie's face drained of color, her jaw slack. Karoline, astonishingly, didn't flinch. The energy in the room flipped like a switch, a sudden powerful surge. Phones shot up, a forest of glowing screens. Staff panicked, whispering frantically into headsets. Rosie's cue cards, now utterly useless, fluttered to the floor. Karoline simply stood, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. The air crackled with an almost tangible electricity. Trump stepped forward, slow but confident, the immense weight of his presence filling the studio like thunder before a storm. His signature red tie caught the harsh studio light. His expression was controlled, calm, calculated. Rosie, for once, didn't say a word. Trump approached the stage, looked first at Karoline with a nod of approval, then turned to the audience, his arms open in a gesture of command. "I wasn't planning to be here, but when I saw this young woman being attacked, ridiculed on national television, I couldn't sit back." The crowd murmured, a low rumble of agreement. Several stood, their eyes fixed on the stage. The camera feed panned to Rosie, whose hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her face a mask of disbelief. Trump continued, his gaze now fixed on Rosie. "Rosie, I've watched you insult people for decades. You call it comedy. I call it cowardice. But when you come after someone like Karoline, someone who actually believes in something, you reveal more about yourself than about her." The studio was silent, every eye glued to the unfolding drama. Rosie tried to interrupt, her voice a strained whisper. "You barged into my—" Trump raised a hand, a simple, decisive gesture that silenced her instantly. "No, you don't get to spin this, Rosie. You brought her here thinking she'd fold, that you'd out-talk her, outwit her, but she didn't flinch. And you lost the room." The audience gasped. Someone clapped, a single defiant sound, then another, then a wave of applause that swelled, undeniable. Karoline stood still beside him, not smug, just resolute. Trump looked at her, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You handled this better than most seasoned pros. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't get personal, you just told the truth." Rosie stood now, her eyes flashing with a desperate anger. "This is still my show." Karoline turned toward her, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devastating. "Then maybe it's time to ask why your own audience stopped laughing." Rosie froze, the words a direct hit. Trump looked directly into the camera, his voice resonating with purpose. "This isn't just about Karoline. It's about what we're teaching the next generation, that mockery isn't power, that conviction beats performance." He turned back to Karoline. "You did good." Karoline nodded but didn't gloat. Instead, she looked at Rosie, a final quiet statement. "You could have had a real conversation tonight, Rosie, but you chose to turn it into a circus." And with that, she stepped away from the chair and walked off stage, head high. Trump followed, his presence a lingering echo. And Rosie? She sat back down, alone, in the center of a set she no longer controlled.
Rosie sat motionless, staring at the empty seat Karoline had just vacated. Her studio, once pulsing with laughter, sharp jokes, and rehearsed dominance, now echoed with something unfamiliar: respect. And it wasn't for her. The cameras kept rolling, their red lights blinking, but even the crew didn't know what to do.
Producers whispered frantically through headsets, uncertain whether to cut to commercial or let the tension breathe, a palpable silence hanging heavy in the air. The audience remained still, many of them looking toward the stage door, almost hoping Karoline would return, but she wouldn't. Backstage, the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Karoline leaned against the hallway wall, her breath calm, steady. Trump stood beside her, arms folded, a rare half-smile playing on his lips. "You didn't need me," he said, his voice softer now, devoid of the public bluster. "You already had it handled." Karoline looked down for a second, a flicker of humility, then up. "But they needed to see someone stand beside me." Trump nodded, his expression serious. "And now they have." Inside the studio, Rosie finally stirred. She stood, grabbed her cue cards, now useless, a crumpled mess in her hand, and tried to regain control, to salvage what was left. "Well," she said, forcing a grin that didn't reach her eyes, "that was unexpected." Weak applause, scattered and hesitant, met her words. She cleared her throat, a dry, rasping sound. "I hope you enjoyed the, drama tonight. But let's be honest, facts still matter, and I'll have plenty of them next week." It rang hollow, a desperate plea for relevance. A few loyalists clapped, their hands sounding like lonely echoes. Most didn't. Online, the moment had already exploded. Clips of Karoline's calm takedowns flooded X and YouTube. The quote, "Why did your own audience stop laughing?" went viral within minutes, a devastating indictment. Trump's dramatic entrance, his line about "mockery isn't power," became a trending soundbite. News anchors, usually so quick to dismiss, began to weigh in. Was Rosie finally outmatched, they mused? Karoline Leavitt, poised under fire. Trump and Leavitt flipped the script on late-night television. At Fox News, Sean Hannity opened his segment that night with a grin. "I thought I'd seen everything until Karoline walked into Rosie's house and took her chair." The narrative was no longer Rosie's. And Karoline? She didn't tweet. She didn't post a single word. She didn't have to. The story was already telling itself. By morning, every major news outlet had the clip. Karoline sitting calmly, Rosie fumbling for words, Trump walking onto the set without hesitation. It played over and over again, dissected from every angle. Liberal commentators tried damage control. "It was an ambush," one said. Rosie was outnumbered. But viewers knew the truth. It wasn't numbers that had won the moment. It was composure. It was clarity. It was Karoline. At a diner in Ohio, a retired veteran watched the replay on his phone. "She's got grit," he muttered, shaking his head with admiration. In a cafe in Georgia, a group of young women shared the clip on TikTok, stitching reactions. "That's how you stand your ground." Meanwhile, Rosie O'Donnell's team scrambled behind the scenes. Publicists issued statements blaming unplanned interruptions and disrespectful staging, but no spin could erase the fact that she'd been outmaneuvered, not just by Trump, but by a 27-year-old who never raised her voice. Karoline, back at the White House, received a brief call. Trump's voice was firm yet proud. "We've taken punches for years. Last night you threw one back, with facts, with strength, and with grace." Karoline thanked him quietly, then opened her email. Hundreds of messages from supporters, but what stood out wasn't the praise. It was a short email from a college student in Arizona. "I've always been scared to speak up in class. Last night I saw what it looks like to speak with courage. Thank you." Karoline closed the message and looked out the window. She hadn't come to fight. She came to remind people, especially young women, that they didn't have to accept the roles handed to them. Not in politics, not in media, not anywhere. And the best part? She hadn't needed to shout. She simply stood. Within 48 hours, Karoline Leavitt trended across nearly every platform. News cycles struggled to keep up. CNN aired tense panel discussions, trying to reframe the moment as political theater.
But even some of their guests admitted what the public had already seen. Karoline had walked into hostile territory, held her ground, and walked out stronger. Fox News, meanwhile, treated the event like a campaign victory. She didn't just debate, one anchor said, she dominated. With facts, with courage, and without a teleprompter. In classrooms, on campuses, and around kitchen tables, people talked not just about what Karoline said, but how she said it. Calm, clear, focused. She didn't mock, she didn't shout, she simply confronted the attack and flipped it into a moment of power. Rosie's followers fought back online, accusing the show's producers of setting her up. Some said Trump's entrance was orchestrated chaos, but the truth didn't need to be defended anymore. The clip lived on its own. The public had made its decision. Meanwhile, Karoline sat at her desk at the White House, sipping coffee and reading transcripts. Aides walked in, telling her about calls from donors, supporters, and political analysts that now believed she wasn't just a spokesperson, she was a rising force. One aide asked, "Do you want to issue a statement?" Karoline shook her head. "I think we've said enough." That night, in a quiet moment, she opened another email. It was from a woman in her 60s. "I grew up thinking I had to be quiet to be respected. Last night, you showed me otherwise." Karoline smiled faintly. The story wasn't just about Rosie or even Trump. It was about something bigger, a cultural shift. A reminder that strength isn't measured by volume, it's measured by resolve. And this time, the whole country had watched it unfold in real time. 3 days after the broadcast, Karoline Leavitt stood behind the White House podium not as a trending figure, but as a spokesperson who had earned something far more valuable than applause: credibility. Reporters filled the briefing room, unusually silent as she approached. Gone were the smirks, the condescension, the second-guessing. Even the most liberal correspondents had taken note. She hadn't just survived a public ambush, she'd redefined it. A reporter raised her hand. "Ms. Leavitt, would you say the Rosie O'Donnell moment was political theater or personal conviction?" Karoline paused, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "I'd say it was personal conviction broadcast on political theater." Chuckles echoed around the room, not mocking, but impressed. Later that evening, Trump called her into the Oval Office. "You did something we've tried to do for years," he said, handing her a signed copy of the New York Post cover, "Karoline Crushes Rosie." "You flipped the narrative without losing your cool. That's not easy." Karoline thanked him, but as she walked out, her mind wasn't on headlines. It was on what came next. Because this wasn't about a single moment. It was about a shift. She passed a staffer in the hallway who smiled and whispered, "You made a lot of young women rethink their limits this week." Karoline nodded softly. Outside, the spring wind carried echoes of the confrontation. But she didn't carry its weight as a burden. She carried it like armor. Not because she won an argument, but because she proved something simple and lasting. That truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it clearly, calmly, and without fear. And this time, that someone had been her. Some moments aren't just debates, they're turning points. Karoline Leavitt walked onto Rosie O'Donnell's stage as a guest, but left as a symbol. She was mocked for her youth, ridiculed for her beliefs. Yet she didn't raise her voice. She didn't strike back with insults. She responded with clarity, strength, and conviction. Her answer didn't just silence Rosie, it made a nation pause. This story reminds us power doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing firm when it matters most. That night, Karoline didn't just win an argument. She lit a path for others to follow. If this moment moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal what real strength looks like. Like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and comment below with your thoughts on Karoline's incredible composure. Thanks for watching.